This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Annie Coleman in St. Louis, Missouri, in February 2006. The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. Chapter 13. Well, I catch my breath and most fainted. Shut up on a wreck with such a gang as that. But it warn't no time to be sentimenterin'. We'd got to find that boat now, had to have it for ourselves. So we went a-quakin' and shakin' down the starboard side, and slow work it was, too. Seemed a week before we got to the stern. No sign of a boat. Jim said he didn't believe he could go any further. So scared he hadn't hardly any strength left, he said. But I said, come on. If we get left on this wreck, we are in a fix, sure. So on we prowled again. We struck for the stern of the Texas and found it, and then scrabbled along forwards on the skylight, hanging on from shutter to shutter, for the edge of the skylight was in the water. When we got pretty close to the cross-hall door, there was the skiff, sure enough. I could just barely see her. I felt ever so thankful. In another second I would have been aboard of her, but just then the door opened. One of the men stuck his head out, only about a couple of foot from me, and I thought I was gone. But he jerked it in again, and says, "Heave that blame lantern out of sight, Bill." He flung a bag of something into the boat, and then got in himself and sit down. It was Packard. Then Bill, he come out and got in. Packard says in a low voice, "All ready, shove off." I couldn't hardly hang on to the shutters, I was so weak. But Bill says, "Hold on. Did you go through him?" "No, didn't you?" "No. So he's got his share of the cash yet." "Well, then, come along. No use to take truck and leave money." "Say, won't he be suspicious what we're up to?" "Maybe he won't, but we got to have it anyway. Come along." So they got out and went in. The door slammed to because it was on the careened side, and in a half-second I was in the boat, and Jim come tumbling after me. I out with my knife and cut the rope, and away we went. We didn't touch an oar, and we didn't speak nor whisper, nor hardly even breathe. We went glidin' swift along, dead silent, past the tip of the paddle-box and past the stern. Then in a second or two more we was 100 yards below the wreck, and the darkness soaked her up, every last sign of her, and we was safe and knowed it. When we was 300 or 400 yards downstream, we see the lantern show like a little spark at the Texas door for a second, and we knowed by that the rascals had missed their boat, and was beginning to understand that they was in just as much trouble now as Jim Turner was. Then Jim manned the oars, and we took out after our raft. Now was the first time that I begun to worry about the men. I reckon I hadn't had time to before. I begun to think how dreadful it was, even for murderers, to be in such a fix. I says to myself, there ain't no tellin' but I might come to be a murderer myself yet, and then how would I like it? So I says to Jim, the first light we see we'll land 100 yards below it or above it, in a place where it's a good hiding place for you and the skiff, and then I'll go and fix up some kind of a yarn and get somebody to go for that gang, and get them out of their scrape, so they can be hung when their time comes. But that idea was a failure, for pretty soon it begun to storm again, and this time worse than ever. The rain poured down and never a light showed. Everybody in bed, I reckon. We boomed along down the river, watching for lights and watching for our raft. After a long time the rain let up, but the clouds stayed, and the lightning kept whimpering, and by a flash showed us a black thing ahead, floating, and we made for it. It was the raft, and mighty glad was we to get aboard of it again. We seen a light now away down to the right on shore, so I said I would go for it. The skiff was half full of plunder which that gang had stole there on the wreck. We hustled it onto the raft in a pile, and I told Jim to float along down and show a light when he judged he had gone about 2 mile, and keep it burning till I come. Then I manned my oars and shoved for the light. As I got down towards it 3 or 4 more showed, up on a hillside. It was a village. I closed in above the shore light, and laid on my oars and floated. As I went by, I see it was a lantern hanging off the jackstaff of a double-hull ferry-boat. I skimmed around for the watchman, a-wonderin' whereabouts he slept, and by and by I found him roostin' on the bitts forward, with his head down between his knees. I gave his shoulder 2 or 3 little shoves and begun to cry. He stirred up in a kind of a startlish way, but when he see it was only me, he took a good gap and stretch, and then he says, "Hullo, what's up? Don't cry, bub. What's the trouble?" I says, "Pap and Mam and Sis and—" Then I broke down. He says, "Oh, dang it now, don't take on so. We all has to have our troubles, and this'n'll come out all right. What's the matter with 'em?" They're... Are you the watchman of the boat?" "Yes," he says, kind of pretty well satisfied like. "I'm the captain and the owner and the mate and the pilot and watchman and head deckhand, and sometimes I'm the freight and passengers. I ain't as rich as old Jim Hornback, and I can't be so blame generous and good to Tom, Dick, and Harry as what he is, and slam around money the way he does, but I've told him a many a time that I wouldn't trade places with him, for, says I, a sailor's life's the life for me, and I'm derned if I'd live 2 mile out of town where there ain't nothing ever going on, not for all his spondulicks, and as much more on top of it. Says I broke in and says, "They're in an awful peck of trouble, and—" "Who is?" "Why, Pap and Mam and Sis and Miss Hooker, and if you'd take your ferry boat and go up there—" "Up where? Where are they?" "On the wreck." "What wreck?" "Why, there ain't but one." "What, you don't mean the Walter Scott?" "Yes." "Good land! What are they doing there, for gracious sake?"